Good evening. Welcome to Tulare County Voices at 210. My name is Paul Hurley. I'm a retired editor for the Visalia Times Delta. And I'll be moderating tonight's forum. Disinformation. How we make sense of information in a digital world. Joining me this evening are four experts on that particular subject. Catherine Doe, editor and publisher of the Valley Voice newspaper here in Visalia. Silas Lyons, executive director of the USA Today Network for Northern California, including the Visalia Times Delta. Carrie E Monteiro, who's a public information officer for Tulare County Health and Human Services Agency, and Jim Boren, retired editor of the Fresno Bee and now executive editor of the Fresno
Fresno State Institute for Media and Public Trust.
Institute for Media and Public Trust. Tulare County Voices at 210 is co-sponsored by the Visalia Times Delta and First Presbyterian Church. It's a monthly forum dedicated to exploration of issues in our community. And normally we hold these at 210 in Visalia at that particular venue. But during the pandemic, we've been away. We've been doing remote calls. We hope to be back to 210 next month. 210 is owned by First Presbyterian Church, and we are very grateful for their co-sponsorship of these forums. Okay. Let's get down to it. When we came up with this idea, we were thinking especially of providing help for people who were having difficulty wading through a lot of information, especially about the pandemic. So think of yourself as a typical consumer. I'm worried about the pandemic. I'm confused, and I don't know whom to believe. How can I make a decision on what to do? And this is going to be how we are going to, the theme that we're going to pursue throughout this forum in coming to that objective, to be giving you, the viewer today, some practical advice and guidelines on how to sift through all the media that's coming at you, decide which is reliable and which you shouldn't pay attention to, and how to make decisions based on that media. So to start out, we want to find out how we've come to this point of having so much distrust for media. Why have we as society become absorbed in debating the truth? And what is fact and what is not? How do we come to the point where we have alternative facts? I'm going to start by asking Silas Lyons that question. Silas, any ideas on why we have so many different versions of the same thing now?
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to everybody who's involved in organizing this. And what an important conversation to have. I'm not sure what I did to you to deserve to have to try to tackle that question first. Well, I'll give it my best shot. I've been in the newspaper business, however you define that, for about 25 years now, and that's kind of my frame of reference. I was thinking about the question of historically what's happened here and trying to figure out a good way to frame it. And then earlier today, I was listening to a podcast that Cheyenne Romero, who some of you in Tulare County may be familiar with, she has the best podcast recommendations. And so I'm listening to Slow Burn Season 5, which is produced by Slate. And they're talking about the Iraq War and what happened and how we got convinced to go into Iraq with, what everybody now agrees is kind of devastating consequences. The interesting thing, where it comes back to this whole thing, was an anecdote where Dick Cheney at one point went to the CIA to get confirmation of something he already believed or wanted to believe, which was that Saddam Hussein was involved with Al-Qaeda and had some connection to the 9/11 attacks. Therefore, that we would have a good pretext for going to war to defend our national interests. And he went to the CIA and asked for a briefing, and they told him everything he did not want to hear. And the folks who briefed him were the analysts. And the analyst's job, the way it's described, is to vet the information that comes in from the field. So all of the assets all over the world who are, are talking to CIA field agents, that stuff's getting funneled up through these analysts. And then they give it a good vetting. They try to figure out what is credible and what has no credibility or relevance whatsoever. And they filter it down to what is worth actually passing on to big decision makers. So why am I going through this long thing? Well, because one of the things that Cheney asked for was the raw intelligence. He no longer wanted the analyst to filter it. He wanted to have it come to him exactly as it arrived from the field. And the consequences of that are pretty well known at this point. A lot of really, really shoddy decision making that occurred based on, people getting information that was unreliable and forcing it into a narrative that confirmed what they already believed. So what's happened with us as a society? I think we've all gone down that path. I think that exact mistake has been writ large across our society, and the amplification of every possible voice without, a really good vetting has led us to a point where it is very, very easy for disinformation to thrive. And very often it is in a position to outcompete the truth. And, alternative facts, what are those? Those are just, those are statements that have, for whatever reason, managed to work their way into the public consciousness and shove out things for which there is more proof, more evidence, better validation, better verification. Those alternative facts are accepted because they appeal to people. They're accepted because they're repeated enough times. They're accepted because they, fit into some kind of a narrative of whether it's my tribe or your tribe. And it is, so I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I'm sorry to go on so long, but that's kind of how I frame up the thinking about these past 15 years.
Let me ask all the journalists here first. In the course of your careers, and you've all had long careers, what have you observed about changes in communication? Are facts challenged more than they used to be? And has the media's attempt to present both sides hampered the ability to get at the truth? Jim Boren, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Paul. We're in a time now where anybody can find facts on the internet that support their position. So this has now empowered people who have no other expertise in a particular area to now say they are experts. And we used to have that. Silas in his long career would know that. But those kinds of oddball theories were kind of squashed, and we didn't hear them. Now people have their own platforms on social media and podcasts and other places where they can get a following that can repeat those oddball things that have no basis in fact. Then the other thing we have going is that we're in a time in our history where we do not believe experts. If you're an English instructor, you must not know anything about grammar. If you're a doctor, I can't trust you to give me good health advice. If I'm an engineer and you have a project that I don't particularly like, you're an idiot. I don't know how many times I've seen people with like 14 followers calling Nobel laureates idiot. I mean, this is where we are in our society. That does not mean that the public in general should not question experts. I think they do. I think we as journalists have always done that because they need to be tested, and you can test them, but you don't test them. You test them with facts. You don't test them by calling them names or finding the quote alternative facts that tend to in some people's minds justify their positions, going against what is accepted science, for example.
Catherine Doe, what have you observed in your career about how the public's attitude toward facts and reporting has changed, or hasn't?
Oh, it's changed. Most of my career's only been about 7 years, so most of my experience with news has been as a connoisseur. I've been reading the news since I was in high school, and I think the pandemic was a good example about the truth in media. I for the whole 2 years that's been going on, I don't understand why Dr. Fauci was ever doubted, and he's had threats on his life, and they make fun of him. And to me, he looks like the utmost of the expert. But like Jim said, I don't know why experts aren't respected anymore. And so I just have to throw that out there that it's when did the pandemic happen? Well, what's happened in the last 4 years? It comes down to leadership. And I know that sounds partisan, but the leadership, look who was leader, saying all those lies. The president's been lying to us, and there's Congress members that lie to us, and there's Senate members that lie to us. And I really think it has trickled down from the top. And now it's accepted, just like swearing. I hear swearing on CNN now just because our president started with that infamous phrase about other countries. So that's the unfortunate. I think the pandemic is a very good example of how we've gone downhill in trusting facts. And as far as my experience, I see the downhill as Facebook. That's why I don't have a personal Facebook. I just have a skeleton Facebook that's in my grandmother's name, so I can administer the Valley Voice Facebook. But I go to some other personal ones or just the comments, and it's crazy what the people comment about certain stories. It's so untrue. And then they're not fact checks because all of their friends and all their connections don't dare contradict them. Otherwise, they'll get their ire back from them. There's some real bullies. The bullies on social media.
I hope we will have time to devote to some discussion of the role of social media in contributing to disinformation. Carrie Monteiro, you are on the other end of the equation from the other three folks, and that you are providing the information. You're the one who's giving it to the media and the public. What have you noticed from your end as far as is what you're telling either media outlets or the public as easily accepted now? Do you find you have to justify it, prove it more? What's been your experience?
So my experience is it has definitely changed. I want everybody to know that.
Okay, we got a buffering problem with Carrie so far. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It has definitely changed, and I'll share this with everyone. For me personally, it's very much more scrutinized, especially in this pandemic. As a public information officer, I have not only the pandemic, but multiple emergencies in Tulare County. I have worked in the emergency operations in disseminating and providing information to the people of Tulare County for multiple fires, for floods, for hazmat emergencies. And you may not see me on camera, but I've been called in to help provide and message to the people what they need to know so they can make decisions for their safety. And this pandemic is the first time I have been simply called a liar and completely false. even though it's been vetted by subject matter experts, by a group of them in multiple layers. And what I found most interesting, and I will share this with you, is the pandemic has been so long. But in Tulare County, we had some fires, and I got called into those operations. Now, you saw the firefighters as the face of that, but behind the scenes, I was helping disseminate on social media and helping give updates on websites and alerts to the public for their safety. And it was really interesting to me as the information I would put out pre-COVID was not challenged, extremely challenged during COVID, and then went transition to help with another emergency incident. And the information that I was putting forward.
Shoot.
She's just getting to it too.
I know.
All
But
right.
for me, it was very, the irony is my methods of getting the information to the people I take very seriously. And we have our system to get the right information to people. But during the pandemic, even with our systems, it wasn't resignated. We were seen as liars.
Are you saying that people are more skeptical of the information you would provide them after the pandemic, even though it's not about COVID? It might be about, it might be about the fires or some other public crisis or emergency, but people are more skeptical of that than they were before COVID?
No, I would say not as much. When I went back to work with these fires, the Windy Fire and KMPH, and I would put forth information, we would get praises. Thank you so much.
Oh,
And it
okay.
was like,
Okay.
okay, they like us during a fire, but they don't like us during a pandemic.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because
Paul, can I ask something?
people have come up with their own opinions about COVID, but they're not, there's not going to be any way they're going to be a challenge you about a fire, I guess. Yeah. Catherine?
Yeah, I was thinking almost when you first brought up this subject that we need to reformat the question and not about disinformation, but why? Why are people believing the lies and the fringe? I mean, we can all remember the fringe elements and we all would laugh at them. I mean, why would people not believe Carrie? I mean, look at that face. She's so trustworthy and beautiful. And it's just like, what would her motivation? People aren't asking themselves, what is their motivation to lie about the pandemic? Or, of course, they accuse me of lying. Why would I lie about a cemetery, for God's sakes? That's kind of what I'm at. Why are people believing what they do? That's the question I have.
Well,
I think if I could jump in, Paul.
Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
And I appreciate that because I think both of you have made some very good points. But what we have now is in society, they've been empowered through social media and other kinds of things. They take a position and then go find facts to support it. And if there aren't facts, the facts are made up or created, or you can find them on the internet. There was a time when people listened to the facts and then took a position based on that. So there is a certain segment of society, for example, right now that does not believe. First, they didn't believe there was a pandemic. Then they, all sorts of weird kinds of things. And so anything that a public health official puts out that confirms there's a pandemic and it confirms that a vaccine works and confirms you need to be social distancing and wearing masks, they're going to disagree with it immediately. And not only that, they're going to get very angry with the messengers. I'm sure Carrie has probably felt that. We've seen stories all over the country where public health officials, some of them are resigning because they're being threatened, their families being threatened. They go to their homes and hold rallies because they dared give the data about the number of people dying of COVID.
Well, we had a little discussion in our planning about this, about some of the factors that are contributing to this, and obviously the internet is a big one. Silas, how is that contributed to this problem of people, first of all, deciding on their own position and then searching out facts to justify it rather than the other way around?
Yeah, until all this happened, I had not heard the fancy term confirmation bias. I remember the first time I Googled that a few years ago. Like, what's that all about? It's this exact thing, and because we've split out into, so much of what you all said resonates with me. We have split out into so many different factions, and there's a voice for every faction. If QAnon can become an American phenomena, like if something as just I can't even say, I'm not even sure I can use the adult language, but something as completely crazy as QAnon can become a phenomenon in this country. There's a splinter for every faction. And I don't pretend to be an expert on how the psychology of this works, other than I've heard this explanation that the world is increasingly complicated and scary, and these things we face are huge. I mean, existential crises, like a pandemic that a lot of us, I'm sure people, some of you, certainly me, I know people that have died. I care about some people that have died. Climate change is like this huge existential thing. The fires that Carrie mentioned are happening more, and they're bigger. And I grew up in the mountains just above Fresno, and my mom's property is burned over 4 times in the last 5 years. These are big, scary things. So we look for these ways that we can just kind of put the world back into a box we can understand. And then social media has given this incredible, just, rocket fuel to this craziness, and amplified all of these voices and allowed people to tune into only the folks they agree with and tune out everything else. And we find ourselves in a place where we are. We're having to sort of scramble to compete to try to get some kind of a purchase for verified fact in this insanity. And I just want to say, Carrie, it is a huge respect to you for carrying on the work in the face of that. I know the vitriol that's out there, toward folks in public health who are doing this work, and it really truly is, I think, noble, heroic work right now to try to keep pressing on with that.
How much is the decline in traditional media, print and certain extent television, and the rise of social media contributed to all of this? Anybody who wants to start? Jim?
Yeah, I'll start.
You start.
Go ahead, Jim.
Either one.
Well, and I'll be real
okay.
quick. I think, and then you can get it, Catherine. I think this would have happened even without the decline of traditional news media, because social media is so powerful. But the fact that local journalism in communities all over America are not there to fact check what's happening at city council meetings and school board meetings, then you have those problems with information in your community. And if you believe in a democracy, you have to believe in an informed citizenry. So if people aren't getting good information about everything from what's going on at the school board to what's going on in Congress, they're going to fill that vacuum. And social media is just built for relaying non-factual information.
Catherine?
Yeah, and the social media also amplifies or magnifies our deteriorating attention span. I was shocked because I don't use Facebook personally. And I remember one day, a couple years ago, when I finally realized when people, we post our articles like all, Vice Times Delta and Sun Gazette and Fresno Bee. And I was shocked to finally figure out that people were just reading the headline. They weren't clicking on the article. And so they'd read the headline, which is short, and then they would go on and comment. They'd write their comments that were completely wrong because they hadn't read the article. So the short answer is social media has had a lot to do with the decline of print media And I think people still watch the news. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
old fashioned. I still watch TV. That
Yeah, I'll tell you, people just reading the headline and then firing off a letter to the editor,
Yeah,
it was not invented by
exactly.
social media. They did that. They did that long before social.
Yeah.
With
Letter to the
newspapers a long time
letter to
ago.
the editors, man, that's over. They do it straight on Facebook, and I feel sorry for Carrie because she is a warrior. She has to be up there, the face of the county. Me, I can turn my computer off for days. I can disappear for days, and I can look at the comments and I can laugh. It's not my, I'm not being. If I'm challenged, I can kind of giggle at it. But she goes in every day and has to face this. And another thing we have to say that the county is facing, and it's going to be hard, is the drought. So she has it coming for her now with the drought and all the wells going dry.
Yeah, that's been ongoing. Silas, do you think? I'm curious what you might think about this. If legacy media, if traditional media, especially print newspapers, were stronger, would that have been able to neutralize social media, some of the effects of it, or is social media just too powerful? We never would have been able to overcome it. I mean, even if we had circulation levels like they were 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think Catherine just said something to that effect, that the social media is so powerful that it's hard to imagine that we would have been able to just steamroll over that kind of a force in our society. I don't see that happening, but it is certainly real that things have happened at this incredibly accelerated pace, just because the rise of social media was not only taking audience away from traditional media, it was taking money away from traditional media. And as a result, it depleted American newsrooms in really dramatic ways. And the folks on this panel, I know, are, very familiar with that. For anybody watching who's not, you can go to, any newsroom in America, but particularly in the newspaper industry, you'll find they're working probably maybe 1/5 of the number of journalists, if you're lucky, that you would have found 20 years ago. And so, some of the folks that we lost first were copy editors, and copy editors were paid to question reporters who were paid to question sources. So you had levels of verification that were going on. In retrospect, gosh, that was really a luxury. I don't think we realized it.
That's all right. I went through a lot of statistics today about the decline in newspapers, loss of about 6,000 personnel in newsroom over just the last 5 to 10 years, 200 newspapers, almost all of them local community newspapers, out of business, gone, a vast increase in the number of so-called news deserts. So we know that newspapers are in steep decline, regrettably, and they're holding on. I would also submit that that traditional media, legacy media, tended to have gatekeepers, people who were in charge of what information got through out there, and social media doesn't have that. I used to get wacko letters to the editor all the time, but I wouldn't put them in the newspaper. But now they come onto my screen every morning. So it's definitely a different world. What else has contributed to all this, do you think? Are people just more willing to grasp onto strange ideas?
Well, one of the things that I thought, and I can't remember who on the panel said it, but I thought it was very good, that as things have become more complicated, people are searching out for easy answers. And I think that this is a very complicated society. There's a lot of pressures on people, and as people lose jobs, as they're transferred, as their salaries are decreasing, they're angry. They want somebody to fix it, and they can blame society. They can blame the governmental structure. So you have all these people looking for those easy answers, and then someone says, "Well, the reason you lost your job is because of this happened that President Biden did, 2 months ago. And there's my easy answer. And then I'm going to put that on my my internet page, and that's how I go to explain things. And this does not just happen on the right; it also happens on the left as we look for reasons. One of the things that I see is these most recent elections in New Jersey and Virginia. The analysts say that either the right or the left, depending on whether it's Jersey or Visalia, won or lost. And what I saw as a former political writer is the middle one. I think that and we need to have more people in the middle politically so we can get consensus. This idea that that the Republican Party is run by extreme conservatives and the Democratic Party is run by extreme liberals, you're not going to get anything done. And we see that today with the infrastructure bill.
Anybody
Paul,
else?
if I might, I would really like to ask Carrie a question related to all of this, which is, in this kind of an environment where people are wanting to pick and choose their own facts and wanting to kind of go for easy answers. I'm just really curious because you sit in this space between like scientists and the general public, and science is complicated and it hasn't had much time to deal with this pandemic. The answers change sometimes because new research happens, and yet, you're trying to give a clear message, and you're trying your best to get people to hear that message because it's life-saving. I just wonder how you navigate that, given how difficult this environment is.
It's a challenge, but I would say it's not done all by one person. And you're correct. Science is complicated. I would echo and compare it to sometimes when we have to take information from engineers and bring it down to the common man to understand. And the same thing with this pandemic. It's been complicated. It's novel. It's new. It's change. The scientists are learning hand in hand with all of us. And what I have found is, and that's our jobs and my job as a communicator, and we have a great team, is taking jargon into the common man who is sitting in his living room, who can understand that. And I've worked with this also with in emergencies and fires, when we talk about fire spotting or moving and correlating that with medical. I sit there and I work with these experts like, no one's going to know what that is. You're a firefighter. That's your jargon. But the grandmother who doesn't know anything about the science or may not have even finished high school, we got to bring it down to their level. And it's a challenge, but we do our best. And what I commonly do is, and what I tell my team is, we're not talking to science. We're talking to your sister. We're talking to your neighbor. And how would you explain this to them? And we have this dialogue back and forth. Is there sometimes this scientific level? We must say it like this. I understand, but that's not going to resonate with a person who doesn't have a master's degree in epidemiology. And I really give credit to our public health officials and our doctors, is get out of your official jargon and talk like you would talk to a patient who is trying to understand that. And we always try to put ourselves in that mindset of the consumer. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we have terms that we must use, but I try my best to take the information and funnel it into something that I can share with my grandmother over the dinner table.
Glad to hear you say that, Carrie, because I know as editors and those of us who've been journalism instructors, we are constantly harping on that with our reporters and our students to keep jargon out of their work. It's one of the biggest problems in creating prose that is not readily accessible. And And we obviously want to make that relatively accessible. Tell me, Carrie, how are you received by your media outlets? You see any change there, especially because, they're going to tend to be a little skeptical too.
I would have to say our local media here in Tulare County, and others have asked me this, is very fair, in my opinion.
Oh man, she was just giving you guys a compliment here, and we lost her.
Has increased, but the biggest change is, and this is not so much a change, it's been prolonged, but I have been way more accessible than ever before. And that's because of the need. The news is so fast, there's high expectations, and we have to be accessible. And I would say local media, very fair. I often tell, and I've worked with elected officials, reporters and editors and publishers can't publish what you don't say. You control the interview. And I know some people struggle with that, but I do have to commend our local reporters. They have been very fair, in my opinion. And they challenge, and they should challenge. And I often tell the executives that I work with is that's their job, and it's our job. They're challenging that for the people. And if a reporter asks you that question, there's probably someone sitting in their living room wondering the same thing, because they're consumers as well. And so in terms of the changes, the accessibility has increased. It's a lot faster. The expectations has risen. I would definitely want to share the margin of error is very slim. The public can be very unforgiving. And that's been really a lesson learned with me and my team is we're humans. We're going to make mistakes, and people are going to call us out on it. But they have that high expectations, and we're going to deliver the.
Yeah, I would suspect that things move a lot faster for you now too than it did back in the days when there was one deadline a day, rather than it's constantly deadline now.
Paul, can I ask Carrie a question? As we were kind of going down this road a little bit. In your county, the vaccination rate is very low, as I understand, well under 50%. Does that reflect on the makeup of the people who question what public health officials are doing? Essentially, are they not getting vaccinated for political reasons or for health reasons, or do you have a take on that? And then how do people interact with you if they don't believe in the vaccine?
I wish I knew why they weren't. It's definitely a struggle, but there was one of the doctors that said something early on in this pandemic, because I'm not from a medical background. I'm a communicator. I'm from a communications background, and it was struggling for me to understand. But a doctor said, to me and working with is, look, in the medical community, we're used to people not taking our recommendations. If it was true they wanted smoke, they would watch their weight. But even though they don't listen to us, doesn't stop us. We're still going to give them the information and recommend them for the betterment of their health, whether they choose to take our suggestions or not. And that really resonated with me to keep going. And I really have to say, our public health officials, our hospitals, our healthcare workers, I'm sorry, my internet is not the strongest, but they're all still here. The public health officials, Dr. Hott, our epidemiologist, the entire team, they never left. They never got wavered. And even though it's disheartening that there's other factors coming at play, at the end of the day, we're going to give them the information and the recommendation so they have what they need to make the best decision for their health. Whether they choose to heed our advice or not, we're going to continue to give it because we care. And that's what the medical healthcare professionals do. And they have done before this pandemic, and they're going to continue to do after it.
Carrie, do you think part of the problem might be that Tulare County doesn't have a real strong media media network, media range. I mean, God bless the Visalia Times Delta. I used to work for it. It's a main newspaper in Tulare County, sure. But it's not a large newspaper, and we do not have really a lot of other media outlets centered here in Tulare County. Is that a factor, you think?
It is very true. We are in the Fresno market. Part of the Southern County is in the Bakersfield market. But of all the television news stations, we only have one South Valley reporter. And I often work with our programs, why don't we have more news media here? Well, if they're going to take the drive of an hour with a camera and film crew, we got to have something really newsworthy. Yeah. And a lot of the bureaus have gone down. And so what I have found in our changes of communication is we have become the publisher. We have been giving the content just because, like you all as journalists, you're at a fifth of the staffing, like that was shared earlier. And so I very much of they're strict. So if we can give them the information and the media, or in the early bits of the pandemic, the media, you all were taking our daily updates and putting them straight on TV or straight into radio. And that's just because everything happened so fast. And so instead of working directly with reporters, we became the publishers.
Yeah. We need to turn a corner here. We've been talking so far about kind of like how things have been deteriorated and some of the negative things about media and how disinformation is spread. We really want to make this program a forum to give people some advice and some strategies in how to detect disinformation and to get stronger information for themselves through media. So we have an eight-part strategy here, thanks to the Institute for Media. Here we go. It's on your screen now. All right.
Paul, can I talk through that?
Yep.
So these 8 tips have come since we created the Media Institute at Fresno State 3 years ago. And they're pretty basic, and you'll see them in a lot of places that look how to verify information. But one of the things that we found with the constant is that look past your own political biases. Whether you're on the left or the right, you're going to believe a story that is a fake story if it confirms your biases, whether you're on the left or the right. And I've seen this on both sides. Do you recognize the source of the news item? Is it coming from a trusted news source? If it's not coming from a trusted news source, it may be a legitimate news source. You just may not know about it. So, but check it out. That's always a good idea. Use search engines to see if anyone else is reporting this particular story or information. If this story is so big, somebody sooner or later is going to get it. Even if a news outlet has broken it, sooner or later that stories come out. Don't believe that the entire mainstream news media has a great story, but they're going to keep the lid on it because they have some political agenda. No newsroom is going to have a great story and sit on it if they think they're going to be the first one out there with it. Check the link in your browser. Many fake news sites try to mimic actual news sites. I saw one where they were mimicking abcnews.com, and it was a site that was abcnews.co and then some other extension, and people thought that was a legitimate site. Check the browser link. Look at the other stories on the website. Do they pass the smell test? Do these news stories do they have legitimate headlines and do they have bylines, and are there other information, or are they just a handful of stories stuck up there with a lot of exclamation points and capital letters? The public has seen enough legitimate news sites that they ought to be able to find one that's not legitimate. Read the contact us and about us links. Are they working? Can you contact them? Do they get back to you? to give you information about the site. And then go to fact-checking sites, Snopes, factcheck.org, PolitiFact. There's dozens of these, hundreds of them. The first time I put this up, someone told me, well, Snopes is a left-leaning news site and you can't trust it. I said, okay, go to some of the 200 other ones and use those fact-check sites. And then finally, be skeptical. It'll serve you well in everything you do. We always tell our reporters, be skeptical, check out all the information, and it'll help you get better. This isn't a perfect list. The most complaints I have from people who have read it says, well, it's going to take a lot of work. Yeah, probably. But there are ways to verify information.
Yeah, it probably will take a lot of work. Beginning with one of the first things that's kind of implied in that list, but isn't explicit, and that is refer to more than one news outlet. Read more than one newspaper. Watch more than one cable news feed, and certainly sample different social media rather than just one. But that is difficult. That takes time, and we had a complaint. We were talking about this the other day that there's an expense involved in that sometimes too. I mean, I read 4 or 5 newspapers a day, but I don't expect everybody to subscribe to 5 newspapers as I do. Silas, what do you think about that? What about the need for referring to more than one news source?
Oh, I think I would absolutely agree that you should have more than one news source. If you find yourself getting everything from one source, especially when you're talking about national, international news or politics or something of that nature, I think you should absolutely seek out a variety of sources. I know, people who aren't even journalists, but who just really care about whether they're getting the real story. One of my friends who is very conservative makes a point of watching MSNBC, and he reads the New York Times, which frequently offends him, and he does it because he cares about verifying the things that he reads, and I think that's a respectable position. I had to chuckle at the final point about being skeptical, because I think the old journalism school thing was, if your mother says she loves you, check it out.
Yeah.
There's
Exactly.
it's worth I guess everybody taking that attitude into the media environment these days, because there is so much disinformation out there. I would add, Jim, that is a fantastic list, and I hope to steal it and reuse it. But I'd add one thing to it, and this is something, as I suppose as an editor for a number of years now, that maybe I've just kind of developed this point of view. But the number of sources who are quoted by name in a story is often a very reliable indicator of whether or not that story is likely to be a real piece of journalism. The laziest way of doing this job, and mea culpa, because I've done it. The laziest way of doing this job is to use one source and run with it. And just repeat verbatim what that person says. Even lazier than that is to use an anonymous source and allow that person, especially, to go beyond her or his area of primary knowledge and expertise, or to offer opinion. And I think that's something we have to guard against in this business. Those of us who hope to retain credibility. I also think that as a consumer of news, it's how I would measure. If you were to take across the board and you were to count up the number of named sources per story in any particular news outlet, and then compare it to another, I would be willing to bet you quite a bit that you would find that the source that routinely uses more named sources is unless it's explicitly partisan or something. But if they're doing journalism and they routinely use more named sources, I would be much more inclined to rely on that for my information.
So the better sourced an article, usually the more reliable it is.
It just in my experience, I think there's a real correlation there. And I mean, don't get me started on anonymous sources. Anonymous sources can be useful. They can sometimes have information that no one else has. But it is downright disgusting and lazy how much some media outlets rely on anonymous sourcing. And in Washington, I've always just been a local guy. I've never worked in DC. The few times I've had to call DC, I'm blown away by people who are like, well, nobody in this town uses their name. I mean, it's like this thing that they expect you to know. That's crazy. That's ridiculous. We should expect to know who's saying things.
Silas, is that kind of reporting, do you think, led to a erosion of trust in news?
I absolutely think so. I mean, some of this, let's be honest, some of this we've earned fair and square, right? I mean, any of us who've had journalism done to us, and I know Carrie could raise her hand 50 times, but any of us who've had it done to us had this experience that it's hard to convey what you want to say when somebody else has full control over how much of that to use and not use. I'm always talking to reporters about trying to have a little empathy for sources, because it's not easy to trust a reporter with what you have to convey. So yeah, I think reporters and editors who are careful, we don't get it right all the time. I should be a little bit humble about this. If we're careful, we can have more sourcing, we can have more named sourcing, and we can listen a little closer to what sources are trying to tell us so we can try to get it right. And those are really important things. And so I guess, to me, if we're getting back to the question of how do you know who to trust? I trust most the sources that I find do that the most consistently. Whether that's local sources that I go to for my information, or whether that's national sources. I think those that really do a lot of original reporting, quote a lot of sources, and treat them with respect and care to try to get the facts right.
Let me remind anybody who's watching this program that we are accepting comments and questions from you. You can post those in the comment section on a StreamYard, and we will ask them of our panel here. So it's a chance for some interactivity, some participation. Please, looking for your questions. In the meantime, Carrie, have you ever gotten burned by a reporter?
Yes, from time to time, but I would say from my experience, and it goes back to a lot of what I've done, 9 times out of 10, they're putting what I say, and it takes practice. And I've even caught myself is if you don't say it, they can't write it. And sometimes, sure I stay on message. And so it happens, but you move forward, you move on from it.
Catherine, what do you use as far as judging reliability of a news article or of media?
I think the point that Silas brought up about the sourcing is really good, and I realized that we do a lot of that with the Valley Voice. And I did want a point of clarification, because Silas has a lot more experience than I do. Before I did the Valley Voice, I was not a journalist. Anonymous source for the Valley Voice has always been we don't print it unless we know who the person is. We check out that person to make sure they are who they say they are. And we don't use any quotes from them unless we know who they are. Some of them are in such a precarious situation, especially with social media, that they will get attacked or they could lose their job if we use their name. So we call it an anonymous source, but they absolutely are not anonymous. And that's what, because we'll get blasted for that. Oh, you used an anonymous source. It's like, yeah, they weren't anonymous to us. We corroborated everything that they said. I was wondering if Silas had a different view on that.
I think my view is mostly aligned with that. The standards that we have are that if we do use it, first off, we would not use an anonymous source if a named source is available. So we should always use a named source if possible. And we should talk to anonymous sources about the reasons why they're asking to be anonymous. And then you mentioned corroboration. I think that's a really important point. If an anonymous source tells you something, then the need to corroborate that is much greater. And like you said, their identity needs to be known. And not to get too deep into the weeds about it, but if we pledge an anonymity to somebody, we're making a really pretty serious commitment. In some cases, obviously, journalists have been held in contempt for refusing to name their anonymous sources. And so one of the things that we do by policy is that not only the reporter, but their editor has to know the identity of the person. And part of that is so that the reporter never ends up being kind of hung out there by themselves. If it were to come to that, the editor's in on it too. So it's just a very high bar. It's not an absolute prohibition, because you're right. There are times where people have really legitimate reasons they can't use their name, and their fear of reprisal is real. And I would never be one to advocate that we should ban that or anything like that.
Jim, Boren, what is media literacy, and why is it important?
Well, media literacy is important because everything we touch these days generally comes from a keyboard. We do our banking, our education, we read news sites, we pay our bills, and so you need to understand media literacy in a way that it is a smart tool. If you remember 15 or 20 years ago, they talked about the schools needed to teach financial literacy. Well, media literacy is as important as financial literacy, and in some cases, it's that same way. At Fresno State, we're actually spending a lot of time on media literacy, just to try to be a resource for the community. If you are media literate, you can understand the various messages that are being communicated to you by all sorts of folks. I mean, everything from the spam and phishing calls that you get through the internet to legitimate information. So you need to be able to identify the truth and be able to filter that information through a media literacy lens. We advocate that media literacy should be taught at the earliest K-12 grades, and in fact, the State Department of Education has a goal of doing that, and I think that's good. And the other thing is, media literacy is not restricted to one medium. It's all the news sites, but it's all the other kinds of things that they come into contact on their keyboard, from gaming to however else they use it. So media literacy is kind of a catch-all term now, but it's something that we all need to know, and I think that the youngest people in our families, need to understand that there are bad actors out there that want to take their money or do worse.
How do we acquire it then? Is this? I hope this is another one of those things where you have to take a couple of journalism courses for it, or I know you've advocated you should teach media literacy.
Well, I mean, I think
in public schools, like in high school at least, but
Well, I mean,
How do
I'm,
we-
I'm talking down in the third grade,
Third
you
grade.
know, at the level there, so they understand it. I have some friends, the kids are 6 years old. They have their own phones. One
Yeah.
has an iPad.
Yeah.
I'm stunned. I said, well, do you give any training on that? Well, they know the games they're going to go to. And I said, well, do you know the games that you don't want them to go to that they might be? You know, we give our children these devices, but we don't teach them how to use them.
And there's and there's some risk lurking behind some of those games, isn't there? We already know the answer to that over to that one. So, how do we know whom to trust? How do we know what sources to trust? How can we discriminate?
Well, I mean, and I'll just take a whack at it. I know that the rest of the panel will have good explanations, but commit yourself to sorting out what's right and what's wrong. And if you use our 8 tips or other similar tips, you can figure that out. You know, my grandfather used to tell me about all the door-to-door salesmen that used to come in his neighborhood to sell him all sorts of stuff. And he'd have all these terms for them. He'd never buy. But, you know, those people are coming through those neighborhoods selling you that vacuum cleaner or whatever they're selling because somebody's going to buy. They don't need everybody on the block to buy. They need one person on the block to buy. And so, you know, people need to arm themselves. At the Media Institute, what our goal is to empower the public with media skills so that they can do these things on their own. They can become their own experts in using the devices they want to use.
We have a couple of comments that have come in, so I want to direct that to the entire panel here, and whoever wants to pick it up first, just let me know. The first one is a reader asks about the strain of anti-intellectualism in America, which is historic, really, that leads to information. Now, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I guess it might be, how do we correct that? Or can we? I don't know.
Well, I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a real tough one. That kind of came up when President Obama was running for office in 2008, and they kept on calling him an elite, even though he was raised by a single mother. So I never kind of understood that. So I don't know if we can battle it. And yesterday, I mean, it just seems to me, I hate to be a defeatist, that it's just getting worse. Yesterday, a group of almost 500 people gathered in Dallas, Texas, waiting for little John Kennedy that died in a plane crash, to reappear and become President Trump's running mate in 2024. So I may not be very optimistic. Yeah. And it was real. I mean, that it was, and then when he didn't show up, and you would think everybody would disband and go, oh, well, I guess QAnon isn't, it was a fringe of, there's actually a fringe of QAnon. And it doesn't make them, no matter when these things don't happen, you would think, oh, well, they didn't inaugurate President Trump on August 13th, like they said they did. So now nobody's going to believe in that group anymore. And it doesn't happen. Then they just go on to the next, and they just go on to the next. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about solving the problem of anti-intellectualism.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how to answer
We moved
that.
on to really big picture problems now. That's
Yeah, I know, right?
I'm with Catherine. I mean, I don't think any of us on this. I mean, you all seem like very highly intelligent, capable people. But if you can bend the curve of anti-intellectualism in America,
Yeah.
I will stand by and cheer you on.
Yeah.
A reader wants to know how low-income people can get reliable, truthful information. We touched on that in our planning meeting the other day about, you have to have a computer to get access to social media. Well, actually, you only have to have a phone, really, anymore. But if you're going to consult, let's say, the Visalia Times Delta, the Fresno Bee, the Wall Street Journal, and the Dallas Morning News every day, you're going to be putting out about $100 a month in subscription fees. How does a low-income person get reliable, truthful information?
Well, the Valley Voice is free.
There you go.
Everybody's welcome to the Valley Voice.
Great plug, Catherine. All right.
Yeah. Woo!
That was well done. Well, you know, Carrie mentioned they're publishing directly, and I don't want to take her thunder, but yeah, go ahead.
But there is information that's free, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge. That very much is a challenge. And in our Health and Human Services Agency, we work with that all the time, is making sure that our information is equitable, it's in cultural competency, it's in language. During this, what has positively came out of this pandemic is we now have a full team to translation and meeting people where they are. And my comment to that is how low income people get information. We have relied heavily and we've always had partnerships, but those partnerships have been strengthened like I've never experienced before with our nonprofit community-based organizations here in Tulare County, the United Way, the CSETs, the Self-Help Enterprises, those organizations that are boots on the ground in the communities, really doing old school word of mouth information, and that trickles. But this is a challenge because of lack of internet access. Some people may not even have a television.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point about community organizations, Carrie. They do get a lot of information out into the community, especially to low-income, marginalized, and disadvantaged people.
Yeah, if I could take a quick swing at that too, Paul. I will point out, you know, and I grew up. Anybody knows where North Fork is? I grew up in North Fork, and you know, we lived well below the poverty line, and we did not subscribe. Sorry, Jim. We didn't subscribe to the Fresno Bee, but we you know, it was something that we bought, as well as, you know, our local paper in the mountains, and that was an important source of information to us. And I won't say we spent a ton of money on it, but there was information available. If I think about how things have changed over time, news organizations like ours that have started charging a small subscription fee for digital content are trying to stay alive and trying to support local journalism that is verified and is important voice in these conversations. And I think we need to, you know, be proud to do that. I don't shrink away from that in any way. I also say that it isn't a very large expense. It's actually fairly small, and I say that as somebody who knows what it's like to be poor. I think one of the biggest challenges is really breaking through the clutter of everything that's out there, and I think especially some nefarious actors will really prey on and target people who you know, who are low income. And they do it for their own reasons, and so it doesn't matter where you fall on the income spectrum. If you truly care about being informed, there are reliable sources that you can access, and I think you know, to the extent that ever begins to change, maybe you know, maybe subsidizing access to strong verified information is a good idea for our society. But for right now, I think the cost barrier, especially for digital subscriptions, is really not terribly high.
You
Silas,
also have that resource.
Bravo, sir, bravo, sir, for sticking up for our local media. Good for you, Jim. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when I was much younger, I used the library a lot. I read national, international newspapers. I was stunned that I could go to the Fresno County Public Library and read the New York Times or foreign newspapers for free. And I would sit there and devour them. It was incredible. And I know that most county libraries now have computers and with access to many news sites. I suspect that there's been cutbacks there, as in probably a lot of other things, but that's also another place that people can go to get a broader a view of the world, and then they might even want to pick up a book and read it. Who knew?
How about that? That's good. Those are great practical suggestions, folks. I really appreciate it. That is good. This next question, it might be a little more difficult, also from the public. The reader writes, it's hard to trust media when you only get one side of the story. We get very little news in Tulare County. So where do we go for our news? Can you guys see these questions, by the way? Under comments? Because that one is under comments. So
I can't see that one.
The reader says finds it hard to trust media because they're only getting one side of the story. They get very little news in Tulare County. Where do we go for news? Silas, you gotta take the first swing at this one, I think.
Well, I think ViceliaTimesDelta.com.
There you go.
since we're all plugging. No, I mean, I think what I would take a shot at is what I think is probably the heart of that question: the idea that there's really truly only one side presented. And I hear this a lot, especially from our conservative readers in all of the markets all of the communities that I work with. There is a strong sense that news is increasingly presented from a point of view, and I'm not here to completely try to shut down that argument. I think if you look at what's happened in the polarization of the country, that the news media does bear some responsibility for being baited into the fight. When we were called the enemy of the American people, we took it personally in some cases, and I think kind of assumed this mantle of standing against the prevailing winds of conservatism in America right now, and I don't think that that's a position that we should be in. I think our obligation is really to represent as fairly as possible all sides of the stories we cover. That said, it is not ever our job, and I will stand by this as long as I'm in this business. This is not ever our job to amplify what we know to be disinformation. And if that happens to be coming from one camp, we should never be sort of taunted into well, we have to represent that side. No, we don't. Not if we know it to be false. We do not need to amplify disinformation, and that is not a political statement. That is just a statement of where I believe a journalist should fall. So, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I do think that there's some culpability on the part of media for becoming combatants in this whole thing, and at the same time, I think we have an obligation to the truth that we have to keep foremost.
Jim Boren, what do you think about that point of view that the media is not to be trusted because it only gives you one side of the story, and often it's the liberal side,
right? And that's been going on forever. I remember, as a political reporter 25 years ago, there was a variation of that argument. But here's where I think that the commenter has a point of view, which is from the standpoint, there are so many news deserts now where the Visalia Times Delta is one voice, but there aren't all those other voices that there used to be. I remember when I was a young reporter, every community in the San Joaquin Valley practically had its own local newspaper, and the business model worked, and you had a lot of information in a lot of particular ways. I'm with Silas completely that we that if the other side is misinformation or disinformation, that's not our job to report it. The job of the news media is to report facts. I do think that a lot of local media in the Valley tend not to have enough alternative voices on their opinion pages, and I think that could go a long way in meeting some of the complaints of some people on the right. That said, if someone wants to be an opinion writer and write a column that contains false information, you just can't go down that road. But I think in our valley, there are a lot of really good conservative writers that base their arguments on facts, and I think that would help buttress the political argument around each community. And I would hope that we not only strive for diversity, but also diversity in opinion on our local newspapers.
From the email, we have a question for the panelists. Where do the panelists get their news? And for journalists, besides their own publications, where do the panelists get their news? I obviously subscribe and read daily the Vaccination Times Delta and the Fresno Bee, and have for 30 years. And I've read the Boston Globe and the New York Times for even longer than that, almost every day, and a couple of other newspapers from time to time when I decide to go to the Chronicle or to the Chicago Tribune or the Washington Post. I'm a subscriber there now too. So when I watch television news, usually PBS NewsHour. I mean, I'm kind of a poly consumer of media. I do a lot of it, and I would suspect that most people who work in the business are pretty much the same way. Silas?
There are some specific local sources, like for example, up here in far northern California, I really like the Lost Coast Outpost out on the coast. I think they do a really great job. In other communities, there's local weeklies, and I used to work in San Luis Obispo. The New Times in San Luis Obispo is like their punching bag. But I read them all the time. I like people. But nationally, I'd say the Wall Street Journal I find to be very authoritative, and to meet that kind of test of original reporting and sourcing, along with the New York Times. When they're the thing with the Times, when they're good, they're the best, and when they're bad, they're really bad. But generally speaking, good source. USA Today, of course, a little biased, but I do read USA Today, and The Economist when I can. I just think The Economist is probably one of the best examples of just authority and balance that's out there. It's just really kind of.
Catherine, different news sources that you read?
Well, I obviously read the newspaper every day. And I also have to say that I know there's some local newspapers that have gone under. I remember there used to be the Woodlake Echo, and but there's a lot of, if people want the news here, it does exist. There's, the Vaccination Times Delta, the Fresno Bee, the Sun Gazette. There's the Valley Voice. There's the I think there's a paper in Dinuba. There's the Portable Reporter. So there's plenty of newspapers. And they all seem like, when I read the articles, I just never get I don't get the opinion pieces are opinionated, but the articles seem to be very reasonable, not biased at all. I don't see. And then of course there's the Valley Voice, and they all seem to be sourced and have a lot of sources for their articles. So I think there's a lot. I think one desert is, it does seem that Tulare does get the short end of the stick. They haven't gotten full. They get coverage here and there, but it's really too bad that Tulare doesn't have their own newspaper. And by the way, the Valley Voice covers Kings County and Tulare County, and Kings County Hanford has been a real joy for me to cover, because you'll get the Hanford City Council meeting will be attended by 70 people, and nobody agrees. They all disagree with each other, and the public comment lasts an hour, and they're all very civil. It's a great exchange of information, and then the city council comes together, makes very monumental decisions for the city. But there's lots of newspapers here, though. People look for them.
Got a nice newspaper in Hanford too. The Sentinels does a good job of covering that.
Yeah,
community.
there's the Sentinel. Yeah.
Jim Boren.
Yeah, this is a question I ask my students at the start of the semester. Where do they get their news? And they're and they come from all over the valley. But when they're in class, they say that the local news or the local news sites, the TV sites, they spend a lot more time, surprisingly, on the broadcast sites than they do on the news sites. At least surprising to me, being a former news journalist. And then also, where do they get their national news? And it's all over the lot, from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. But I have a lot of students that really like BBC. They like it because it's just a little bit different take on national news in the United States. It's also got a great website that it's very easy to maneuver through. And the students ask me, why are newspaper websites so bad? Why, when I'm trying to read a story, am I getting all sorts of ads popping up in the middle of it? Why, when I'm signed on to a news site and then I click on a Twitter link, I can't go to the news site. They want me to go in again. They haven't figured that part out. So, as someone who is now studying newspaper websites, they're really, really, really bad. And trying to read it, we worry about bringing customers in, and then we give them a million reasons not to stay with us. I'm stunned that this is the business model in newspapers today.
Yeah. I want to get to Carrie about the question, but first, Silas, what about that with news websites? Because you're in charge of like what, 5 or 6 of them, right?
I am. I'm not. I'm not directly in charge of the website.
Yeah, I know you're not drawing them up or anything. I'm not blaming.
I've actually
you.
done that. I've done that in a past life when we were doing that more at the local level. All I could say is I so wish I could disagree with the sentiment, but it is one of several ways that we inflict pain on ourselves and our readers on a daily basis. Yes, I agree with Jim's students. Why can't we figure that out? We've known for eons that the user experience was bad in many cases, and across the industry. For the most part, it's still quite bad. Part of that has to do with how we sell ads and how we present those ads. But I would argue that Facebook and Google figured that out, and they made a lot of money that way. So
Yeah,
not sure why it's so hard.
yes,
for us.
they
I
did.
wish I had a better answer.
I wish the newspapers would realize that people are coming to their sites to consume news, not what's in the ads. They're there to consume the news, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Carrie, what sources, what newspapers, what outlets do you consume? Besides the newspapers that you check, make sure you're not misquoted.
I would echo everyone else. I rarely watch national news broadcasts. I very much stick to our local ABC 30, Fox 26, and 24 and 47. I rotate them. And our local newspapers. And then going to my suggestion with the unbiased, I rarely watch national cable news. I very much watch our local news. And I've kind of found that's where being on the side delivering the news and then seeing the product, for me, that's where I've built my trust, because I do believe in our local reporters. They're trying to tell our local community stories, and they're trying to get to the facts and so our residents are more informed. So echoing everybody else, I really, really look at local publications the most.
Paul, you're on mute.
Silas, is that Benjamin Franklin? Is that Benjamin Franklin's bust behind you? And if so,
That
yes,
is
it
one.
is.
Yes.
And
that
if
is-
so, is that because your newspapers mint money? Is that that's not it, is it?
This let's see, keep him in the frame here for a
There you
second.
go.
Ben was a gift to me from a fellow named Wayne Estelle, who was retired as a prison warden from the California Men's Colony, and we bonded over a shared interest in Franklin and his legacy. But I will point out, as we're talking about misinformation, that that Ben was also known as Silence Do-Good when he was lying to the local newspaper and submitting opinion pieces from, supposedly from a woman who lived at the edge of the forest nearby, and she had a lot of opinions that Ben didn't want to have them pinned on him directly. So it's not like misinformation is brand new.
Yeah, the founding fathers are pretty good at spreading misinformation, actually. Jefferson, Adams, all those guys. But Ben was one of America's first printers. So
Yes.
that's very, very it's very apropos that he be on your desk.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm fond of that. Thank you to whoever asked that question.
Okay. We have 5 minutes left. So one more question I ask you all to go around. How do you test a fact? How do you test a fact or a source, but a fact, to know that it's true? Carrie?
For me personally, because I'm delivering the information, I really test it with our subject matter experts. But outside what was suggested earlier, I Google and see if multiple other sources are doing it, if it's not an anomaly or an outlier. And that's kind of my test to see if it's actual factual, because it's been vetted in multiple arenas.
Perfect. That's exactly the kind of advice we want to leave here with folks. Catherine, how do you test a fact?
With our stories, we tend to get I can't Google them because nobody else has written on them. So we have to get corroboration first, because we're always answering our phone. We'll get a story. I can't Google it because it's not on Google. It's
How about a fact you consume, one you're reading?
Oh, when I'm reading, well, I look up all the newspapers to see who owns them. You look up the Gannett, and it's like they don't have a horse. You can believe what they say because they don't seem to have a horse in the race. They need to be a successful business. So they're in it, for the finances, not just to inform people. So you can see Gannett doesn't have a horse in the race. I don't know who owns McClatchy, but just go in and see who owns the newspaper. As far as Valley Voice, we have no horse in any race. We just enjoy reporting, and we're like a little guerrilla newspaper. We go in and strike, do it, and then we can pull out quickly. We're very nimble. But go look up the newspapers and see who owns them.
Another excellent piece of advice. Silas, how do you test a fact when you're as a media consumer or a source?
Yeah, as a consumer, I think the list that Jim gave is excellent, and I would just go back to adding what I said about the number of sources and whether they have names. It's very important to me. I'm very distrustful of anonymous sources, as you can probably tell. And to Carrie's point, I think is this person an expert in the field, or is this somebody who is trying to trump up a credential in one area in order to pass off expertise in another. And I think that's always a telltale sign.
Terrific. Jim Boren, I left you for last because I know that you would have come up with something that none of the rest of us have thought of yet.
Well, I think that everybody has come up with some great suggestions and some great thoughts. The one thing I'll leave you with is that, we talk about social media, we talk about the internet, we blame a lot of things on the internet, just as a lot of people blame a lot of stuff on the media. The internet, there's so much information at our disposal. if you're smart, you have good media literacy skills, you can sort those facts out very quickly. That's the beauty of it. Now, you remember in the old days, you want to know, who did that song? You just Google it. You ask Siri. I mean, they're doing all the work for you. So there's a lot of technology has done a lot of good for us. You just have to use it smartly.
This 90 minutes has flown by for me, folks. I hope it has for you. It's been informative. It's been fascinating. I hope it's been helpful to our viewers. Once again, I want to thank Catherine Doe, editor, the publisher of the Valley Voice, Silas Lyons, executive editor of the Times Delta and Gannett newspapers in Northern California and the USA Today Network, Carrie E Monteiro, Public Information Officer for the County of Tulare, Health and Human Services Agency. Thank you. And last but not least, actually most, Jim Boren, Executive Director for the Media Institute at Fresno State. I really appreciate it all. Thank you all very much. One final plug. We hope that 210 is back in 210 in December when we have a treat for our audience. Terry Oman, the prominent historian for Visalia and Tulare County, will be with us to present another one of his history programs. Get there early because it's always well attended. We hope to see you there in December. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and good night.